And welcome to Physics Lecture 4. Today I'm not really going to go over any actual physics, but more over some general problem-solving strategies that will really be of good use to you throughout this course and throughout your physics career. Um, we may not be able to directly apply some of this advice right now, since we've only learned kinematics, but in the coming units, especially in things like collisions and rotations, you're going to find a lot of this advice to be extremely helpful. So first piece of advice is draw a diagram for each problem. For example, if you have collisions, draw the particles, draw the directions they're going in, draw their masses, stuff like that. If you have a particle with forces on it, draw a free body diagram which shows where all the forces are pointing, and we'll cover all of this later in the course. But it's good because it gives you spatial reasoning. Your brain is very good at reasoning with space, and it gives you kind of an intuitive understanding of what's going on. You can see, oh, the particle is moving this way and it'll accelerate this way because you already know that from your real world intuition, and physics is describing the real world. And so in each physics problem we have knowns, unknowns, and we set up equations to find the unknowns from the knowns. So you have to list out your known quantities and you have to list out your unknown quantities, and the thing about unknown quantities is that you need as many equations as unknowns in order to solve for all of them. For example, let's say I have a problem where I have a particle that's accelerating, right? And I want to know the time it takes for it to accelerate to some final velocity. So let's say I specify the initial velocity, the final velocity, and the acceleration, right? So now we have one unknown, the time, or two unknowns, the distance. Either way, we have three known quantities, and we can definitely set up two or three equations, right? We know our kinematic equation, delta x is equal to in the initial times delta t plus 1/2 acceleration times delta t squared. And we know our kinematic equation, v final squared minus v initial squared is equal to 2 times a times delta x. So we can set up both those equations in order to find the two unknowns, t and delta x. Sorry, delta t and delta x. But let's say we don't know the initial. Now we have three unknowns and two knowns, and we aren't able to make three equations, so we aren't able to solve the problem. So when you're writing out your solutions, you should write it out in terms of variables, in terms of numbers. And there's some advantages to using variables and some cons to using numbers. So the good thing about using variables is once you find a solution, it works for every value of variable within the scope of your problem. Like, if the number you thought was in the problem was wrong and you use the numbers to find your answer, then you're going to have to do your problem all over again. But if you solved it in terms of variables, then you can just plug in the right number. Also, if you're using a calculator, you can press the 4 button instead of the 7 button and you're never going to notice. But when you're writing a variable, let's say you write a p instead of a q, you'll notice it and you'll be able to fix it pretty easily. So that's always good because you need to trace your errors if you find a weird solution. And it's also easy, and this is something that I've run into many, many times personally when solving physics problems. It's very easy to lose track of your path when you're working with numbers. Because when you're working with variables, for example, you'd write x squared over y. But let's say we're working with numbers and we said x is equal to 2 and y is equal to 4, then we have 2 squared over 4 is equal to 1. And we have no idea where that 1 came from if we leave the problem, get up, get a sandwich, and then come back, and then we forget, right? So it's always good to work with variables just because, you get that ambiguity is all gone. So we have a couple of tools to narrow down if our solution is actually correct or if it makes sense. And one of these tools is using unit analysis, which we're going to cover in the next lecture, dimensional analysis. Sorry, not lecture. We'll use dimensional analysis in the next lecture. But for now, let's start with the idea of a special case. So a special case is when you take a general problem and you take a specific subproblem within that problem. and it's a subproblem that it's much easier to intuitively understand, and it's one that you're very easily able to predict the solution to. So, for example, I have a problem here. What's the time it takes for a ball to fall a distance d if we're considering drag? Right? And we're assuming that the ball started at rest, and it's falling at a rate g, and all that good stuff. And so here I've set up two formulas. Full disclosure, I made up these formulas on the spot as I was writing this lecture. Neither of these formulas are correct. But we're just going to look at them to judge which one of them passes the method of special cases. So two special cases I can think of right now are if the ball is falling a distance of 0, and if the ball is falling an infinite distance. Now obviously if you think about it, a ball that is falling a distance of 0 takes a time 0 to fall that distance of 0. So that is a special case. You may think, but that's stupid, that's obvious, but it's a special case of your formula. Your formula should be able to predict that it takes 0 time for the ball to fall 0 distance. That's a special case. Just like how a square is a special case of a rectangle, or a small point is a special case of a circle because it has radius 0. It's a degenerate case, a special case. Either way, it has to work. So let's try our first solution here, which guesses that t is equal to r squared over d times v sub t. So I'm using r here to represent the radius of the ball, since balls should be spherical, and I'm using v sub t to represent the terminal velocity. And the reason I've chosen these is so that it works out with the units. Again, I just made up these formulas. I didn't actually do any kind of rigorous derivation here. But these formulas both give the right units, so they would pass the dimensional analysis test that we're covering next lecture. But let's look at the first one. So if the distance is 0, then we have time is equal to r squared over 0 times v sub t, which is equal to r squared over 0, and dividing by 0 is not allowed. It gives us infinity or undefined, depending on how you think about it. And neither infinity nor undefined are equal to 0, so clearly that's wrong. But the second formula, t is equal to d squared over r times v sub t. If d is equal to 0, then we get t is equal to 0. So that is what we would expect with the special case. And let's try again using the case of a ball with no radius and a ball with a large radius. And obviously the ball with the large radius would fall a lot slower because of increased drag effects. And so the first formula predicts that correctly, that as the radius goes to infinity, the time increases because its time is equal to r squared over d times v sub t, right? So as r increases, t increases. But the bottom formula has t inversely proportional to r, so as r increases, t decreases, and that's incorrect. And so by combining those two tests, we can see that neither of these formulas pass our special case test, and so both of them are absolute garbage. And a final one, this is for kind of when you get a numerical answer, is think about the order of magnitude. So I'm going to touch on this concept called scientific notation, where if we have any number at all, we write it as the product of a number that is greater than or equal to 1 and less than 10, and an exponent 10 to the y, so basically, like let's say we have 10,000, that's 10 to the 4, so we would write 10,000 in scientific notation as 1 times 10 to the 4. And let's say we have, 15,360. We would write that as 1.536 times 10 to the 4. So basically, the thing to do here when considering orders of magnitude is that we call the exponent at the end the order of magnitude. So all the numbers that we'd write as something times 10 to the 3, which is between 1,000 and 9,999.9999999, are all in the third order of magnitude, and so on. So basically, when you get a numerical answer, think, is it the right order of magnitude? Is my answer way too big or way too small? So I've included an example problem here. I am from California, so this is a very Californian problem. Let's say I am using physics to calculate the amount of time it would take for me to drive from San Francisco, where I live in NorCal, to Los Angeles, which is pretty far away in SoCal. And I know from experience that usually this drive takes about maybe 5 to 7 hours if you're fleet on your feet, and 10 hours if you're taking a scenic route and stopping for lunch and dinner and all that stuff. But if you found an answer of 0.1 hours, that's 6 minutes, that's very obviously wrong. I'm not sure if you'd be passing the speed of sound, but I think you would be. And that is clearly impossible. So if your formula for time it takes to travel a distance gives 0.1 hours for this distance, it's clearly wrong. And so is an answer of 1,000 hours. I don't think it takes that long to walk from here to Los Angeles. You know? So, like, we know that the correct answer is, between 5 and 7. That's around 10. It's closer to 10 than it is to 1, so we can say that it's on the order of 10 to the 1. That's 10. And our first fake answer here, 1,000 hours, that's 10 to the 3. And our second fake answer, 0.1 hours, that's 10 to the negative 1. So both of those are way off in terms of order of magnitude, and we can see that they're not at all close to what we intuitively know that they should be. So clearly this is wrong. And kind of a practical application of this, something I once read in a Brian Greene book, is that one guy's idea for kind of a grand unified theory of electromagnetism, like a string theory kind of thing, found a completely wrong value for the mass of the electron. And because of that, the order of magnitude was way off. They disproved the theory even though it was very nice and clean. Obviously, I'm probably misremembering this anecdote here, but the point is that order of magnitude analysis is a very powerful tool because sometimes you have experimental measurements. You could say that I did an experiment. It takes an average of 6 hours to drive to LA. And so if my formula says it takes 6,000 hours, then obviously it's wrong. So it's good to use all these tools to narrow down and see if what you've actually got is the right answer and an answer that makes sense. And we will be revisiting these tools later. I know that obviously I haven't provided many concrete examples here, but thinking in terms of these things, how can I check if my answer is true? How can I see if my problem is solvable? How can I try to disprove my answer? Thinking like that is part of thinking like a physicist, and so it's important to be able to master these skills. Alright, well, thank you for watching today's lecture.